The sky ruptured at 3:33 a.m. It began as a shimmer, something barely perceptible to the naked eye, as if the air itself had wavered in confusion. Within moments, that shimmer deepened into a spiraling void, dark as the deepest reaches of space and crackling with arcs of pale electric fire. The rupture expanded, swirling like a wound that refused to close, bleeding light and shadow into the night. At the northern hemisphere's highest scientific observatory in Greenland, alarms blared. Dr. Elias Voss, groggy from a restless sleep in his lab, pushed himself upright as the sirens reverberated off steel walls. The mechanical voice of the system chimed overhead. Unidentified gravitational anomaly detected. Immediate response required. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes, his stomach tightening. Elias had spent years chasing the unknown, charting distant exoplanets, detecting cosmic anomalies. But this was different. It wasn't distant. It wasn't theoretical. It was here. He rushed to the observation deck, joining the hushed murmurs of his research team. A panoramic screen displayed a live feed of the sky, and there it was. A spiral of impossible darkness slowly descending, pulling the stars inward like a vortex. Whatever it was growing. "Magnify," Elias ordered, his voice sharper than he intended. The image zoomed in, revealing a procession of shapes emerging from the spiraling rift. Ships, but unlike anything humanity had ever conceived. They weren't sleek or mechanical. They writhed, ribbed organic structures resembling vertebrae fused with plates of glistening black chitin. Tendrils of pale bioluminescence snaked along their surfaces, pulsing with dim, eerie rhythms. The ships moved with a biological grace, like vast floating leviathans. The room fell silent as the first of the vessels breached Earth's atmosphere. It released no shockwave, made no sound, only a soft distortion in the air, like a held breath. They hovered in eerie stillness above the vast expanse of tundra. Their immense shadows swallowed the horizon. Then came the voice. It was not transmitted through conventional frequencies. It didn't need to be. It invaded the mind directly, raw and unfiltered. Elias staggered as it hit him, a chorus of alien intonations harmonizing in an unsettling cadence, forming words that scraped across his thoughts like talons. "We seek the flesh-bound, the bearers of the spark. Your kind walks between ruin and divinity." Elias's breath hitched. The words burrowed deep, threading through his neurons. He glanced at his colleagues and saw his terror mirrored in their faces. No one knew what to say. The silence that followed felt infinite. The voice continued. "We seek the origin of the sacred shape. Flesh is the conduit. Teach us." The message ended as abruptly as it had begun. Then came the descent. The largest of the ships lowered itself, its form shimmering and refracting, as though it were only partially present in this reality. It came to rest on a ridge just beyond the observatory, its surface undulating like the muscle of a sleeping beast. The air grew thick with an ozone-like tang, metallic and sweet. Elias felt it on his tongue, a taste like burnt copper and rotting petals. The observatory's communication hub erupted with frantic transmissions. World leaders, military commanders, and scientists across the globe were all demanding answers. The international defense grid had already been mobilized, But Elias knew that humanity's weaponry was meaningless against something this vast, this unknown. A chime from the main terminal caught his attention. A single line of text appeared on the interface, seemingly written in real time by an unseen hand. "Designate your emissary." A chill ran down Elias's spine. He didn't understand how, but somehow the ships, the beings, were asking for a representative. And they weren't asking the world governments. They were asking him. "Dr. Voss," someone whispered behind him, "they're choosing you." He turned, stunned. It was absurd, impossible, but there was no mistaking the reality. The word emissary pulsed again on the terminal screen, glowing faintly with an organic hue. The next few moments passed in a blur. The research team argued, pleaded, debated. Elias's mind felt like it was unraveling. He wasn't a diplomat. He was a scientist, a man grounded in logic, in biology and data. He had spent his life unraveling the mysteries of living systems, yet he felt completely unequipped for this moment. But beneath the fear, something else stirred, a grim sense of inevitability. When he finally nodded, agreeing to the unthinkable, the room grew deathly still. A low hum reverberated through the floor, rattling the walls of the observatory. The nearest ship responded, splitting open like the petals of some grotesque flower. An entrance, dark and pulsating, formed at its center. Elias stared at it, his mouth dry. It beckoned. A voice echoed again in his mind, softer this time, almost pleading. "Step forward, emissary." He stepped into the abyss. The sensation was immediate, an enveloping warmth like amniotic fluid. The world outside disappeared as a translucent membrane sealed behind him. The interior was unlike anything he'd imagined. The walls pulsed with faint, reddish light, as though veins and arteries ran just beneath their surface. The air was thick, humid, and faintly sweet, carrying the smell of something alive but wrong. Elias moved deeper into the chamber, his footfalls squelching softly against the fleshy floor. He was not alone. The beings awaited him, tall, sinewy figures with elongated limbs and glistening, translucent skin. Their forms shimmered with faint bioluminescence, casting eerie patterns in the dim light. Beneath their skin, Elias could see the writhing coils of something alive, twisting veins, quivering organs. Their faces were smooth and featureless, except for the subtle outlines of vestigial eyes that hadn't yet formed. The tallest of them stepped forward, its body rippling as it moved. When it spoke, its voice resonated inside Elias's skull rather than the air. "Your kind was chosen because you remain broken yet whole. Flesh, faith, failure. These are the marks of the divine. Show us what it means to become complete again." Elias felt his pulse thunder in his ears. The truth began to sink in. The Seekers weren't just visitors. They weren't here to conquer or destroy. They were searching for something they'd lost, something they believed humanity still possessed, and they were willing to tear themselves apart to find it. Elias felt his knees weaken as a sudden realization dawned. The Seekers didn't just want to learn, they wanted to become. The tallest of them, the one he had come to recognize as Valar Keth, extended a hand, long and clawed, the fingers tipped with sharp, chitinous points. Beneath the translucent layer of its skin, Elias could see something twitch, a mass of nerve-like tendrils that pulsed faintly, almost like a second heart. Its presence was both alien and painfully vulnerable, like something that had been built wrong but was desperate to function. "We have torn our bodies open to be closer to truth," Velar Keth spoke without words, its voice resonating in Elias's mind. "We have re-entered the prison of flesh, but flesh alone is not enough." The message settled heavily on Elias. They had mutilated themselves, discarding their post-physical forms and reforging their identities through grotesque bodies, only to find themselves incomplete. They believed that humanity, in all its fragility, in all its contradictions, held the answer. "Why do you seek answers from us?" Elias asked, his voice hoarse. He was careful to mask the fear still creeping up his spine. "Why not look to your own past?" Velar Keth leaned closer. The proximity was unsettling. He could feel the heat radiating from its malformed frame, smell the faint scent of decay mixed with something floral and sweet. "We came from perfection," Velar Keth replied, "from symmetry, from oneness. But perfection is hollow. When our bodies were formless, our souls withered." Elias's mind reeled at the enormity of what they had done. They had escaped the limitations of physical life, only to return to it as abominations. Their desperation was palpable. He realized with a sinking feeling what they wanted him to do. The next several weeks became a grim odyssey. The Seekers allowed Elias to leave their living vessel each day, returning him to his team at the observatory with instructions to show them the meaning of faith. But how could he? He was a man of science, a man who had spent his life studying evolution, DNA, and chemical impulses, not divine mysteries. Back in the dimly lit research center, he pored over religious texts, historical records, and philosophical manuscripts. The Bible, the Bhagavad Gita, the Quran, the writings of Nietzsche and Descartes. He read feverishly, sometimes until his vision blurred. His team watched in a mixture of awe and concern. Elias, once dismissive of religion as outdated myth, was now neck-deep in its intricacies, searching for something that could bridge the abyss between humanity and the Seekers. A small group of specialists was assigned to assist him. Dr. Hannah Rivkin, a cultural anthropologist who carried a quiet reverence for ancient beliefs. Father Marcel Ortiz, a priest-turned-archaeologist with scars from a loss of faith. And Dr. Caleb Asner, a neuroscientist obsessed with the brain's perception of the divine. Conversations between them often stretched into tense debates. "Faith is a coping mechanism," Caleb muttered late one night, gesturing toward diagrams of the brain. "It's just neural firestorms reacting to fear of the unknown, a biological defense." "Then why has it endured?" Father Marcel asked, his voice soft but sharp. "Why does every civilization, no matter how isolated, seek something beyond themselves, even when the cost is death?" Elias remained silent. The truth was gnawing at him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had always believed faith was born from weakness, an evolutionary response to chaos. But as he read about martyrs, prophets, and ordinary people who clung to belief in the face of suffering, he began to wonder if faith was something else entirely. Not weakness, but defiance. The Seekers did not wait idly. During one of Elias's visits, he was led into a deeper section of their vessel, a sprawling chamber filled with twitching, cocoon-like structures. The air was thick with heat and an organic hum that vibrated through his chest. Inside the cocoons, Elias saw grotesque imitations of the human form, elongated limbs, faces that had split open into glistening folds, torsos where organs pulsed visibly beneath stretched membranes. The sight made bile rise in his throat. One of the cocoons shuddered and burst with a wet, tearing sound. A half-formed Seeker collapsed onto the floor, its ribcage exposed and fluttering like the wings of a dying insect. Its mouth opened, a maw filled with rows of translucent teeth. But no sound came out. Instead, a haunting emotion flooded Elias's mind. Despair. Valar Keth's voice filled the chamber. "We tried to remake ourselves in your image, but flesh is not enough. We are trapped between ruin and rebirth." Elias knelt beside the dying creature, unable to look away. Its veins were darkening, collapsing in on themselves. It was dying, its body rejecting itself. The creature's twisted hand reached toward him, trembling. Elias hesitated, then reached out and took it. It felt warm, too warm, like feverish skin. For the first time in his life, Elias whispered a prayer, not to any god, but to the unknown. Elias's mind was unraveling. Sleep became a luxury he could no longer afford. His dreams were filled with vivid nightmares, viscera blooming like flowers, stars that blinked like eyes, voices speaking in hymns of sorrow. He woke each night drenched in sweat, convinced that the line between human and Seeker was thinning. The arguments between his team grew more desperate. Hannah believed that faith wasn't tied to religion, but to connection, to the stories humans passed down to survive. Father Marcel clung to the idea that faith was tied to sacrifice, to the willingness to suffer for something unseen. Caleb remained firm in his belief that faith was an illusion, a trick of neurons firing in patterns too ancient to unlearn. Elias, however, no longer believed it was any of those things. Faith, he had begun to understand, was bound to something far more primal. It was about confronting the void and choosing to endure. Elias stood at the observation deck, watching the alien ship pulse with a quiet, organic glow in the distance. The horizon shimmered in the cold dawn light, but all he could feel was the weight of what was coming. Weeks had passed since his first interaction with the Seekers, and the cracks in humanity's fragile unity had begun to spread like fractures in brittle glass. It started with whispers, rumors spreading across the world that the Seekers were not saviors, but corruptors. Footage of the grotesque humanoid forms grown within the alien cocoons leaked to the public. The images of half-formed abominations fused with failed human-like features spread like wildfire. News reports painted the Seekers as a cautionary tale of hubris, evidence of what could happen when something dared to tamper with the sanctity of life itself. At first, protests were scattered, disorganized. People held vigils, praying for guidance or deliverance. But as fear took hold, those vigils gave way to something darker. Groups calling themselves the Shield of the Divine emerged, claiming that the Seekers were profane invaders who sought to desecrate humanity's unique connection to God. Their rhetoric became violent, urging humanity to purge the creatures before it was too late. Then came the bomb. A rogue faction infiltrated the restricted perimeter surrounding the Seeker bioship. Despite the global security presence, they managed to detonate a high-yield explosive. The shockwave rippled across the tundra, shattering windows in the observatory. Elias was thrown from his desk as alarms blared. He scrambled to his feet, panic roaring in his ears as he stared out at the aftermath. A massive gash had torn through the side of the Seeker vessel. Its biomechanical surface writhed like wounded tissue, releasing a keening, inhuman wail that reverberated through the air. Black, viscous fluid poured from the wound, pooling in the snow like blood. The sight made Elias's stomach churn, but the worst was yet to come. The Seeker ship shuddered, its form twisting unnaturally. Something inside it ruptured. A mass of writhing, vine-like tendrils exploded outward, growing at an impossible rate. They snaked across the ground, burrowing into the earth and consuming everything in their path. Entire sections of the forest nearby were consumed in seconds as the tendrils coiled and pulsed with a sickening glow. The ground beneath the observatory trembled. Elias could hear shouts from his team, panicked screams mixed with the groaning of shifting metal. He ran to the nearest emergency terminal, trying to regain control of the situation. His heart sank as the reports came in. Entire villages nearby were being overtaken. People trapped in their homes as the alien biomass spread like a cancerous bloom. But that wasn't the worst of it. Through the chaos, Elias could see the truth. The tendrils weren't just consuming, they were merging. Humans caught in the spread were pulled into the writhing mass, their bodies cocooned in pulsating membranes. Some of them were still alive, their faces visible beneath translucent layers of alien tissue, their mouths moving soundlessly. A wave of helpless horror washed over Elias as he watched a mother encased in the biomass, clutching her child even as their forms began to dissolve into the growth. The response from the global community was swift and brutal. Airstrikes were ordered to neutralize the spreading biomass, despite Elias's desperate warnings that force would only escalate the conflict. Jets screamed across the sky, unleashing payloads of incendiary weapons. The explosions lit up the horizon, sending columns of black smoke into the air. The biomass recoiled but did not die. Instead, it adapted, growing hardened, carapace-like exteriors to shield itself. The tendrils retracted momentarily, only to lash out with renewed force, striking the skies themselves. One of the jets was ensnared mid-flight, its wings torn from its frame before it plummeted into the growing mass below. Elias felt the weight of his failure pressing down on him like an anchor. He had tried to be a bridge between species to teach the Seekers what it meant to endure. But instead, his inaction had helped spark a war. Valar Keth's voice echoed inside his mind, thick with anguish and rage. Why do you destroy what you fear? We came to be remade, but you have made us into monsters. Elias staggered, clutching his head. Their pain was overwhelming. The Seekers weren't just angry, they were breaking. Their minds, fragile from centuries of isolation, were unraveling under the weight of rejection. The next day, the schism became irreversible. Inside the observatory's command center, Elias faced Father Marcel, who had returned from a nearby refugee camp. The priest's eyes were hollow, his face pale from what he had witnessed. "They won't listen anymore," Marcel said. "The people, they believe this is a test. They think destroying the Seekers is the only way to save themselves." Elias slammed his fist against the console, the rage and hopelessness bubbling to the surface. "We're not saving anyone. We're tearing everything apart." Marcel's gaze softened. "They're afraid, Elias, and fear doesn't listen to reason." Elias's pulse thundered in his ears. Outside, the Seeker ship remained wounded, but alive, its outer layers shifting like scar tissue. He knew that time was running out. In the hours that followed, factions across the world began launching their own assaults against the remaining Seeker vessels. The once unified world had splintered into chaos. But Elias knew that the Seekers weren't merely watching, they were changing. He saw it in their forms. Their attempts to mimic humanity had grown darker, more desperate. The shapes they took were less human now and more nightmarish. Twisted torsos, elongated limbs with jagged bones protruding through the skin, mouths that opened too wide, filled with teeth that had no symmetry. They were no longer trying to become human. They were trying to survive. Elias knew he had one chance to stop it. In the silence of the observation deck, he reached out to Vilar Keth with his mind, opening himself fully to the connection. He felt the alien's sorrow and rage, a tidal wave of grief that threatened to consume him. But beneath it all, there was still something else. Hope. A fragile, flickering ember. "Valar Keth," Elias whispered, "let me come to you." The reply was hesitant, tinged with pain. "Why? To witness our ruin?" "No," Elias said, "to end this." When Elias stepped aboard the bioship again, the air inside the Seekers was warm, humid, and thick with the smell of decay and renewal. Elias stood in the center of the huge room, his heart pounding in his chest like a war drum. The walls pulsed with a faint reddish light, casting flickering shadows on the twisted forms of the Seekers gathered around him. They were dying. Vilar Keth, their leader, stood before him, its body grotesquely twisted, barely able to hold itself together. Its once translucent skin had thickened into cracked, brittle carapace. Veins of dim bioluminescence pulsed sluggishly beneath its surface, like the final embers of a dying fire. "Why have you come back, emissary?" Vilar Keth's voice was no longer the deep, resonant hum that had once reverberated through Elias's mind. Now it was thin and fractured, like the whisper of something unraveling. Elias took a step forward, ignoring the stench of death that clung to the air. "I've come because it's not too late." His voice cracked, raw with exhaustion and grief. He gestured around at the wreckage of flesh and bone. This isn't the end, not if we don't let it be." Valar Keth's head tilted slightly, its jagged mouth twitching. "We tried to become like you," it rasped, "but your kind rejected us. They feared us. You feared us." Its fragmented hand twitched toward Elias. "Tell me, emissary, what else remains if not fear?" Elias swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet Vilar Keth's gaze. He felt the weight of every soul lost, the civilians consumed by the growing biomass, the soldiers who died in the futile airstrikes, the loved ones left behind to mourn. He felt the immense burden of failure pressing down on his shoulders. But beneath it all, there was something else, a flicker of something fragile but unbreakable. Hope, he whispered. The word hung in the air like a spark in the darkness. Vylar Keth's form shuddered, the alien's limbs quivering as if the word had struck something deep within it. The other seekers stirred as well, their faint lights pulsing in response, synchronizing like a heartbeat. Faith isn't about certainty, Elias continued, his voice stronger now. It isn't about having all the answers or never feeling afraid. It's about choosing to believe, despite the fear, despite the chaos. It's about standing in the dark and choosing to reach for the light, even when you're not sure it's there. He took another step forward, his eyes fixed on Vylar Keth. You didn't come here to destroy us. You came here because you wanted to understand that feeling, the feeling that even in ruin, something greater than us exists, something that makes the suffering bearable. You wanted to know how we endure. The chamber trembled as Vylar Keth sank to its knees, its body cracking and splintering under the strain. Its head bowed low, as if in reverence or despair. But we are broken, it whispered. We cannot endure what you endure. Elias knelt in front of the alien, their faces mere inches apart. He reached out, placing his hand gently against Vylar Keth's chest. Beneath the thin, cracking flesh, he felt a faint, irregular pulse, the fragile rhythm of something clinging to life. You don't have to endure it alone, Elias said. His eyes burned with unshed tears. That's what you've been missing. Faith isn't something you carry by yourself. It's something we share, something that binds us. Vylar Keth's breath hitched, a shuddering alien sound that resonated through the room. The glow beneath its skin flared, brighter now, a pale blue that spread through its fractured veins like rivers of light. The other seekers began to respond, first with faint pulses, then with rising waves of bioluminescence that filled the chamber. They moved toward Vylar Keth and Elias, their twisted bodies softening, their features flickering with something almost human. We do not understand, Vylar Keth said, though its voice was steadier now, less fragile. Elias smiled, a sad and weary smile. Neither do we, he said softly. That's the point. Outside the ship, the world had fallen still. The sky was stained red from the fires that still smoldered on the horizon. The earth was scarred by craters and vines of alien tissue that had begun to wither and retract. A crowd had gathered, soldiers, scientists, refugees. They watched in silence as the massive seeker ship began to change. The outer walls, once jagged and monstrous, began to soften, becoming translucent and glowing with soft blue light. The ship's jagged edges folded inward, forming something almost cathedral-like, organic but reverent. From the opening at the ship's base, Elias emerged, his body weak but unbroken. His clothes were torn and stained, his face pale. But there was something radiant in his eyes, something unyielding. Behind him, Vylar Keth followed, its form still alien but no longer grotesque. The other seekers followed, their bodies shimmering with pale light. No longer twisted mockeries, but something new, something fragile yet beautiful. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some fell to their knees, weeping openly. Others stared in awe, unable to process what they were seeing. The soldiers lowered their weapons. Vylar Keth raised its arms slowly, a gesture of peace. Its voice resonated not with force, but with quiet reverence. "We are not gods. We are not demons. We are seekers of the unknown, and we wish to walk with you." For a long, breathless moment, the world held its breath. And then, slowly, almost hesitantly, someone in the crowd stepped forward. An older woman with tears in her eyes. She reached out and took Vylar Keth's hand in hers. Elias watched as the two stood together, human and alien, bound not by understanding but by something deeper, something unspoken. In the days that followed, the world began to heal. The remaining seeker vessels transformed into peaceful sanctuaries, their interiors reshaped into places of shared knowledge and unity. The biomass that had spread across the earth withered away, leaving behind fertile soil. Humanity and the Seekers learned from each other, not as conquerors or victims, but as kindred beings seeking the same answers in different ways. Elias knew the scars would remain, some wounds never fully healed, but there was a quiet strength in humanity's resilience, a willingness to move forward even after the darkest night. In the final days before the Seeker's journey to the stars resumed, Elias stood with Vylar Keth on the ridge overlooking the tundra. The night sky above them was vast and filled with stars. "Will we find what we seek?" Vylar Keth asked quietly. Elias smiled, feeling the weight of the stars pressing down on him, but no longer afraid. "I think the answer was never out there," he said, gesturing to the stars. "It's in here," he tapped his chest, "in the questions we ask, in the hope we carry." Vylar Keth's form glowed softly in the moonlight. It nodded slowly. The sky lit up as the Seeker ships began their ascent, glimmering arcs of light that rose higher and higher until they were lost among the stars. Elias watched until they disappeared, a strange ache in his chest. He felt small beneath the cosmos, but not alone. For the first time, he felt whole. As the wind whispered across the ridge, Elias whispered to the endless sky, "We will endure." And somewhere in the darkness, something bright flickered in response.